Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to It Says What with JW3 and Limmud, where we come together to bring you unexpected and poignant Jewish content from across the Jewish community every week before Shabbat. I'm Joe Hyman, JW3's young programmer, and if you don't know who we are, JW3 are the UK's Jewish Community and Art Centre. We're partnering to bring you this program with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. We're really excited to be opening our building in September and are looking forward to seeing some of our regulars and some of the new people we've met over the course of this time online. This series will ask educators, artists, and leaders from across the Jewish community to share an exciting and surprising piece of Jewish wisdom for our time. You can ask your own questions on the feed in the webinar or on the live feed on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll take some towards the end. I'm delighted to welcome Rabbi Natasha Mann, who serves as a rabbi at New London Synagogue and Mosaic Masorti. She has a deep connection with Noam Masorti youth as well. Natasha was born to a lively interreligious and intercultural family in Hertfordshire and discovered a love of God, Torah, and Israel as a teenager. Alongside rabbinic studies at the Ziegler School in Los Angeles, Natasha has worked as a mashgiach, a kashrut supervisor, spent 2 years studying in the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem, and worked with the incredible organization Atzum, Justice Works, on their task force on human trafficking. Quite the bio, Natasha. Welcome. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Good. I'm really glad to have you here in this windy day where a tree has just fallen down over our driveway. So that's exciting. Way to add some vibrancy to this. But I'm really excited to hear the text that you're about to share. What is it, and why have you picked it?
So I've chosen a text from the Talmud, from Masechet Avodah Zarah, which is the tractate of Talmud that talks about relationships with non-Jews. So Avodah Zarah means idol worship. And for the most part, Masechet Avodah Zarah, the tractate, is going to assume that non-Jews are idol worshippers. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, that's the expectation. And I brought it because I have a long love affair with Masechet Avodah Zarah, with the tractate of Avodah Zarah, which is a different thing to having a long love affair with Avodah Zarah itself, with idol worship itself. Because as you said in my bio, I come from an interreligious family. I am half English ethnically and half Indian. The English half of my family is mostly Christian, and the Indian half of my family is Sikh and Muslim and Hindu. It's very confusing, which means that I have a lot of interactions with people from different religions, a lot of very deep interactions with what religiosity means. And I've seen close up what religion looks like in multiple different spheres. So for me, the entirety of this book and the entirety of this concept is not it's not academic, it's not cold, it's not just like an idea that I'm looking into. There's something real about what it's saying about interactions between Jewish religion and with non-Jewish religion. And that's how I ended up choosing this particular text.
Amazing. So I'm really glad that you shared that. And to give context to this incredible text, it's one of my favorite texts, actually, for different reasons. And I'm excited to see what you have to offer about it, and I would offer a different perspective, the 70 faces of the Torah. So here we go. Let's share the text.
Thank you. So it's worth just knowing about this particular part that we're in. We're close to the beginning of Masechet Avodah Zarah. You can see at the top, we're on page 8a. And we've been, the whole tractate starts with non-Jewish festivals and how we can interact with non-Jews around their festivals. And then we get this question about some particular Roman festivals, which we're calling Calendar and Saturnalia. And the rabbis sort of try to explain to us how it fits into the calendar. And in the midst of that, they tell this story. I think it's just absolutely fascinating. They have no real need to tell this story, but it comes up anyway. And this is how the story goes. Our sages taught and this is in context regarding calendar and Saturnalia. When Adam Arishon, when the first Adam, the first person, saw that the day was progressively diminishing. So what this means is we're in the first year of Adam Arishon's life. This is post everything that's happened, Garden of Eden, and we're getting into the winter, and the days are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. He said, "Oily, woe to me. Perhaps because I sinned, the world is darkening around me, and it will return to the tohu vavohu, to the primordial state of chaos. And this is the death that was decreed upon me from the heavens." So Adam Arishon is looking at this situation. He's saying, you know, earlier when God said you're going to die as a result of what happened, this is what God meant. The world is dying. It's becoming darker and darker, and it's going back into the tohu vavohu, the primordial state. And then what happens is he arose and he spent 8 days in fasting and prayer. Worth, you know, keeping an eye on the 8. And we'll move on from there. So once he saw the season of Tevet, so we're in midwinter, we're going past the solstice, and he saw that the day was progressively lengthening, he said, this is the minhag of the world. This is the way that the world works. He went and observed a festival for 8 days. Upon the next year, he observed both these and these festivals. Now, I told you to keep an eye on the 8, which is because, as was just explained in the Talmud, calendar and Saturnalia are 2 8-day festivals straddling the winter solstice. So upon the next year, he observed both these and these as festivals. He established them for the sake of the heavens, but they established them for the sake of idol worship. So this is the Talmud story of the origin of calendar and Saturnalia. It's hugely, hugely unusual, because what we would expect, all we really know about calendar and Saturnalia in terms of the Talmud is that it's an idolatrous festival, and there are ways in which we're supposed to avoid doing trade based on the fact that it's an idolatrous festival. But the origin story is not in idolatry. The origin story is in Adam HaRishon and legitimate relationship with God, and they were established for the sake of heaven. So the Talmud is not saying these are not idolatrous festivals. They're definitely idolatrous festivals. There are definitely rules around how we're supposed to interact with them, but the origin of the idea is in genuine worship of God. And I find this just absolutely fascinating for what it means for their relationship with non-Jewish religion. I also think it's worth bringing up that at this period of time, we don't have much interaction with non-Jews who are not worshipping idols in the sort of classic sense that we might think of it, you know, the Romans and the Greeks and things like that. Christianity is in its very, very early formative stages, early enough and formative enough that they're still in the process of splitting off from Jews. And so the idea that we could look at a festival that's not ours, a festival that's like, of all things, like Saturnalia, it's like as pagan as you can get, and that they can see the origins of that as being in Adam HaRishon's relationship with God, I think is completely fascinating, and not at all what I would have expected before having delved into Talmud Avodah Zarah.
Wow, it's really interesting to see the rabbis talking about this in this way, and it is kind of unexpected to see them attribute this festival that seems now comes into our tradition in some way, or at least into the Talmud, and say that Adam did it. It feels almost controversial. It feels almost kind of heretical if you weren't hearing these words from the Talmud.
The Talmud does a little bit of dancing around the concept of heresy.
What do you think the rabbis were thinking when they were attributing this festival to Adam? What was their purpose in doing this? And what was it? What was the effort? Was it in terms of, you know, connecting our narrative? And when they say that they establish them for the sake of heaven, the sake of idol worship, what does that mean? Does that mean we now take on versions of these festivals for the Jewish people, and they differ in some way?
So I'm hearing a couple of questions on what you just said. I'm actually going to start at the end there with where you asked about how that links back into Jewish festivals, because I asked you to keep an eye on 8, and I'd be interested in how many of you went 8 Hanukkah. Because we also have a winter festival that's based around 8 days. And you might not know this about Saturnalia naturally, but Saturnalia is also a festival in which people lit candles. You know, that's how we get to Christmas candles as well. Like, we have this idea of winter festivals that are about bringing light into the darkness. So the obvious place to go when you see that 8 is to go, hold on a moment, this is about darkness and about bringing light into the darkness. And Saturnalia has a candle thing. Am I supposed to be thinking about Hanukkah? And they don't explicitly talk about Hanukkah here, but I think there is an implication that there is some relationship there, that we are not completely divorced from idol worshippers. We're not idol worshippers. We don't like the concept of idol worship, but it's not that there's the Jews who do the right thing and then there's everyone else who does the wrong thing, end of story. There's actually some sort of interconnected, interwoven history of worship behind it all. So I do think we're supposed to be thinking about Hanukkah. Worth mentioning also, Hanukkah exists on the sort of, we use a lunar and solar calendar. It's mostly lunar. It sort of corrects itself to the solar calendar. The winter solstice is based on the solar calendar, but Hanukkah does this really interesting thing where it comes up in the darkest part of the month. So I think that there's that's where the moon is the least bright. That's when we do Hanukkah. So I also think there's a sort of recreation of the idea of solstice, even within a lunar calendar, that's happening at that point. So I think that would be my answer to that last part about the connectedness. But I also just want to make a note about Masechet Avodah Zarah in general. What normally happens, in my experience, when people pick up this text, whether it's the Talmudic text or the Mishnah, and they start reading Avodah Zarah, it's a great thing to read because it's so interesting all the way through. But it reads to a lot of modern readers as being a treatise on how to avoid non-Jews. It's like, here are the times you can't trade with them. Here are the things you can't do. You can't leave wine with them because they might libate to Zeus. And it's all of these things that read to us in the modern world, as people who interact with non-Jews quite a lot, as being a distancing text. But I actually think that that's not doing Masechet Avodah Zarah justice. I think Masechet Avodah Zarah is kind of the opposite of that. I think that it would be easy in the time in which the rabbis are living, with the texts that the rabbis have inherited from Torah, to think that we're supposed to not interact with non-Jews at all. That non-Jews are supposed to be, idol worshippers are supposed to be completely separate to us, destroy all of their idols, get them out of here, just be as far away from them as possible. And actually, Masechet Avodah Zarah is about the ways in which you can have relationship with non-Jews. We start out with, here are their festivals, don't trade with them on their festivals or the days coming up beforehand. But the implication behind that is you can trade with them the rest of the year, which is actually quite a huge and incredible thing to be implying. So I think there's something similar to that happening here. It's like, yes, these idolatrous festivals are bad. Idolatry is bad. Do not give money to people who are about to go and then spend it on their sacrifices to Saturn. Nonetheless, remember that as I'm pushing them away with one hand, I'm pulling them closer with the other hand, because I'm reminding you that the origin of this festival that we want you to have nothing to do with is somewhere deep in the human soul. It's not just fun with idols. There's something deeper that's calling to all of us, and their response to it is through idolatry.
That's really fascinating. I mean, thinking about the tractate of idol worship, of Avodah Zarah, as kind of something that allows us to connect with non-Jews in a way that avoids kind of idol worship, avoids kind of veering away from our kind of monotheistic perspective is really interesting. It strikes me that this story puts the festivals into this space which makes them vessels for various religions to kind of take on in some way. What do you think about that? Because we grew up with this sense of Pesach is very Jewish and Hanukkah is very Jewish and all these different things, they're very Jewish. But in some ways this is saying festivals are human. It's human to create festivals. And we do them either for God or for idol worship. And this kind of sits us in a universalist story of Adam. So I just wanted to say what you have to think about that. Do you think there's essential parts of Jewish festivals that are particularly Jewish, other than the God element? Or do you think there's actually this humanity that kind of is more broad?
So I think it's really interesting that the two festivals you went to were Hanukkah, which we were just talking about, and then Pesach, because at the risk of being called a heretic, the way in which we do Pesach, the Seder, is thoroughly Greek. It is based on the Greek symposium. Like, we are the one people in the world who still do the Greek symposium. So there is this like thoroughly non-Jewish element to it, and yet it is like the most Jewish thing. I think that's actually really interesting that a lot of Jews, in my experience, get really uncomfortable when you point out that there are relationships between our religiosity and our religious symbols and other religions, especially other ancient religions that we were connected with at the time in which they were developing. But it's true of festivals. It's also true of mythology. When you look at the Torah, when you look at the way in which stories are told through Jewish history, they're not built in a vacuum. They're not completely separate from the rest of the world. I happen to really enjoy mythology. So looking at ancient, Mesopotamian theologies and mythologies, you can see how there's a conversation that's happening between ours and theirs. And sometimes that conversation is pushing away because it's about monotheism, or because it's about universalism, or because it's about something to do with ethics. But sometimes it's pulling closer, and I think that's all about this idea that there's something deeper that's buried in the human soul that calls out to all of us. And it's really interesting to me that we can have this conversation in two ways. We can have this conversation about the ways in which we're similar to the non-Jews, and we can have this conversation about the ways in which we're different to the non-Jews. And depending on which camp you already feel settled in, the other one, I think, should always be in tension and be calling you. If you feel like very comfortably like Jewish and separate from the rest of the world, it is worth keeping in mind that there is a common humanity and something common to the human soul. And if you feel very comfortable with universalism and relationship with non-Jews, it is worth hearing the call of, actually, we did something different with all of this. And I like that, because it means that wherever we are, we should always be experiencing this tension.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. I think it's important for both camps of people to be engaging thoughtfully with where they sit in terms of this universalist versus particular argument, and that seems really interesting to me. I'd love to hear if you're comfortable with it, how this text has struck you as someone who lives in an interreligious family. Has it supported you? And for other people who live in interreligious, interfaith families, how would you kind of use this text as a way to connect with people from different religions, either in your own family or outside?
So my background is kind of complicated. I think you probably got that that impression from earlier, where I think I named at least 4 religions in my close family, 5 if you include the fact that I'm Jewish and also a rabbi. But interestingly, regardless of how complicated my family background is, my parents are both very non-religious, which was helpful in some senses because they came from different religious backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds, and so they didn't have to play the game of choosing. Because neither of them particularly chose their own backgrounds. So I feel like I grew up in a space that was both surrounded by religion and symbolism, and also lacking it. And it took me a while to figure out what that actually looks like. I'm still in the process of figuring out what that looks like. I know that, when I started to become an observant Jew, it was very uncomfortable in some ways, because I had to figure out things like, can I still walk into a church? And I feel like it's very disrespectful of my grandparents if I don't. And is there a difference between walking into a church and walking into a gurdwara and things like that? Having gotten past a lot of the, well, how does this work halachically and how does this work practically, I then started falling in love with mythology in general. And that's where this kind of text really helps me, because once I sort of dove into that, it's like, actually, it's not all just about the practicality. And if you only see it on the level of, can I walk into a church? There's this whole like iceberg underneath that, right? Which is about, what does it mean to be human? What questions are we asking and how are we answering them? That then informs that decision again. I don't know if that made sense, but it's like there's a back and forth between the practical element and the meaningful element that I think this text is really highlighting, because you still can't trade on Saturnalia. Even if I give you this beautiful story about the origins of Saturnalia, and even if the Roman standing in front of me were giving me this lovely story about the origins of Saturnalia, I still can't trade with them on Saturnalia.
I think that interplay between the law and this kind of narrative, which is quite common in the Talmud as far as I'm aware, is so beautiful, and especially when it comes to this topic, because I think it's very poignant in our lives that we're interacting with non-Jews on a regular basis. If we live in the modern world, in our jobs and just in our lives, and if we're not, I think there's a need to be doing that, and seeing this book as a way to actually navigate that in a way that isn't just about law, that's actually about finding those commonalities and finding those beautiful stories of like everyone experiences darkness, is quite beautiful. I wonder if you could say something about idol worship, and for people who don't connect to this idea of idol worship, it's like, I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I can't go into a church. Why can't I go into a church? What do you benefit from saying you can't go into a church? What's the kind of good thing that you get out of that boundary on a kind of rabbinical level or on a personal level, when you're telling congregants kind of this is the halacha or approach of the Jewish law around this? What do you think the purpose of that is in a modern day when idol worship isn't as clear as it kind of used to be?
So I really think it's worth just picking up on what you said. Idol worship is not as clear as it used to be. We live in a very different world now than we lived in 2000 years ago, because the majority of people that we interact with who are not Jews still belong to an Abrahamic religion. And that is unthinkable just over 2000 years ago. It's unthinkable even with the birth of Christianity. It's still unthinkable for hundreds of years that we can have a world in which I might be asking a question if someone is committing idolatry. Sorry, I've been in the book of Hosea a lot recently. If someone is also worshipping the God that I say that I worship. That is a completely new phenomenon. I actually like to do a piece where I track through history of what it is that the rabbis say about non-Jewish religions and what is not idolatry. So I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the idolatry that we find in Torah and in sort of early, in Mishnah and that kind of earlier text is quite literal. It's quite visceral. It's like they're talking about building something and worshipping it. They're talking about a sort of, I think what is like fundamentally a distortion of reality in their eyes. We're not supposed to bow down to the world. We're supposed to bow down to what is behind the world, which is the creator. So that it's quite disgusting, I think, to them, the idea of bowing down to something physical. And then we get the introduction of Abrahamic religions, and it starts out with Christianity, which we kind of, as early as Talmud, we're willing to say, well, that's got to be idolatry, right? I mean, it's like it's not us, so it's got to be idolatry. And it's not really until Islam comes along that the whole thing gets thrown up in the air, because it's really hard to say that Islam is idolatry. You have to really go out of your way to try and claim that Islam is idolatry, because Islam, Muslims are really good at not worshipping idols. Like, they are like top notch at that. So the only way in which we can get away with saying it's idolatry is by saying that anything that's not us is idolatry, even if they're not worshipping idols, even if they're not worshipping foreign gods, even if they're monotheists. And that quite quickly becomes confusing. And we end up saying, well, this is really, Rambam really helps us here. Maimonides really helps us here to say, well, just because they're not right, in my eyes as Maimonides, doesn't mean that they're idol worshippers. And that bursts open a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not going to get too much into the halakha, but it brings up a big conversation about Christianity. I happen to fall onto the side that says that for non-Jews, and this is important, for non-Jews, Christianity is not idol worship, which means that I wouldn't treat them the same way that I might have treated Roman 2,000 years ago. That wasn't really your question. I just picked that up because of the walking into a church question. But what's the importance of maintaining the boundary, I think was your real question. Like, we've talked about the universality of the human soul and the pulling forward with one hand. What's the use of the pushing back with the other? I think that when we don't do that, when we don't see ourselves as being separate in some sense, when we don't see worship of God as being separate in some sense, we lose all of the boundary. If we want to remain Jewish, if we want to think that there's something worth keeping in Torah, then we also, the Torah kind of has to have boundaries to it. And as someone who really likes doing the ancient mythology stuff and the looking at the, at Numeralish and stories like that are similar to ours, if I only ever ask the question, how are they similar? Everything falls apart, because the Torah it's not just recreating creation myth. It's not just repeating creation myth. It's reimagining creation myth. It's asking different questions, or it's asking the same questions and coming to different answers. And we're never going to hear those answers if all we ever do is play the game of what are our similarities.
I think that's so beautiful. I mean, something that I really relate to in the text is seeing those other mythologies in a way so we can see ourselves clearer, and in this kind of in our current world and how we interact with other religions. I think that's also a way of seeing yourselves clearer and vice versa through that interaction. It's a really, really beautiful text. I'd ask you just one line on the story that is shared and what that adds, other than this kind of, is it to kind of humanize everybody? What do you get from that story in the context of this kind of discussion about religion, or do we think it's just added to make everyone feel like, oh, there's this one element that everybody has?
I mean, I do think it's about there being something that's very deep in our souls. I think there's a reason that it's a dam. It's not just someone in the ancient world doing this. It's someone who we are all descended from. So I think there is this idea that something is very deep in our souls. I also think there's an emotional quality to it. That's like, we all, we don't know what it's like to be confused about why the world is getting darker on a physical basis, but we know what that's like on an emotional and spiritual basis. So I think there's also something that we're supposed to really relate to there that helps us to understand one another. We all know what it's like to be confused about the way that the world works. We all know what it's like to feel like things are getting darker. And that's where, religious urge and crying out to God is buried in us, regardless of whether we're a Jew or a Roman.
Yeah, this is really, really wonderful. I'm so glad that you shared this text, because I think it really opens up the world of Avodah Zarah in a way that actually says, no, this isn't just boundary, kind of draw these walls up and close yourself in. It actually, sometimes the halakha, the laws around it, create a structure which we can, preserve our own identities while also learning and trading with other faiths. Thank you so much, Natasha. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing this. And to all our viewers out there, Shabbat Shalom. Take a look at Avodah Zarah, idol worship. It seems daunting and a bit crazy sometimes, but clearly it has a lot to say about the world today and how we interact with others, which is so important. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you again, Natasha, and see you next week with Yael Roberts.
Shabbat Shalom.